Hello, my name is Enrique Garcia. I'm a professor at Tecnologico de Monterrey University in Mexico, and today I'm presenting detecting abnormal fish behaviors with isolation forests using R. The slides and the code for this presentation are available in this GitHub link, and this talk is based on Chapter 10 of my book, Behavior Analysis with Machine Learning Using R. A full version of the book is available in this link. In marine biology, the analysis of fish behavior is essential since it can be used to detect environmental changes produced by pollution, climate change, and so on. Fish behaviors can be characterized by their trajectories, that is, how they move within the environment. A trajectory is the path that an object follows through space and time. A trajectory has two main components: coordinates and time steps. In this example, there's a fish that would like to reach a source of food. In this case, the fish will move through space and time until it reaches the food source. In this case, the blue line is the trajectory that the fish followed. Capturing fish trajectories is a challenging task, especially in underwater conditions. Thankfully, the Fish for Knowledge project has developed fish analysis tools and methods to ease the task. And this is the project's URL. In this project, they have processed enormous amounts of data and have extracted fish information, including trajectories observed in the Taiwanese coral reef. In this video, you can see an example of the footage captured during this project. The dataset consists of 3,102 trajectories, and each trajectory is labeled as normal or abnormal. The normal and abnormal labels were determined by visual inspection by experts. The abnormal cases include events such as predator avoidance and aggressive movements. From this link, you can download the dataset, and if you scroll down, you will find this link that says Fish Trajectories, where you can download the MAT file. In order to read MATLAB files, we need to import the library rMATLAB. Then we can use the readMat function to read the data into a data frame. Here we can see that the data frame has 3,102 trajectories, and each trajectory has 7 attributes. We can extract the first trajectory. Here we can specify the index, and then we can use the structure function to inspect the attributes of each trajectory. Every frame has 7 attributes. The first one is the frame number. Then we have the bounding box x, which is the coordinate. We have the bounding box in y, which is the second coordinate. Then we have the width of the bounding box and the height of the bounding box. The next attribute is the class, either normal or rare. Normals are represented with a 1, a rare is represented with a 2. And finally, the class description is a string, either normal or abnormal. If we overlap the bounding box over the original video, here we can see the final result. Please note that the .mat files do not contain the images but only the bounding boxes information. Each trajectory is represented as a rectangle, but before plotting the trajectories we need the coordinates of the middle point or the center of the rectangle. We can use the following code to compute the center point of the rectangle. Here we are adding the x-coordinate and the width of the rectangle and then dividing by 2. And we can compute a similar for the y-coordinate. We can plot our trajectories using the library trajectory, but before doing that, here I'm making times start at 0. We also need to store the trajectories as a data frame. The first column should be the x-coordinate, the second column should be the y-coordinate, and finally we should add the times. Then we can use the function trajectory from coordinates. We pass the data frame as the first argument and the frames per second as the second argument, and this will return a trajectory object that we can later plot. Now we can use the plot function to plot the actual trajectory. This circle here indicates the start of the trajectory. We can also plot the individual points using the points function. If we take a closer look, we can see that there are some big gaps between 2 points, and these are missing values. Later, we will see how we can fill these missing values using linear interpolation. We can use the trajectory resample time function to perform linear interpolation. We need to pass the original trajectory object. This function will return a resampled version of the trajectory, including the resampled data points. If we print the newly created resampled version of our trajectory, we will get something like this. Here we can see that the newly created points are being plotted here. In order to detect the abnormal trajectories, we will use isolation forests. An isolation forest is an algorithm for anomaly detection, and this algorithm works by isolating anomalous data points. This method is based on trees, and consequently no variable normalization is required. This is one of the advantages of using this type of methods. This is an example of how isolation forests work. In this case, I have only one variable and a bunch of example data points. This is an anomalous data point, and this is a normal data point. The key idea is to try to isolate every data point by drawing a line at a random position. So at the first iteration, I will choose a random position and draw a line there. In this case, my anomalous data point is not yet isolated, so I will pick another random position. Again, my anomalous data point is not yet isolated, so I will pick another random position, and I will keep going. At this point, my anomalous data point is isolated because in this region there's only one point, in this case the anomalous data point. In this case, it took 4 tries to isolate the anomalous data point. Now I will repeat the same procedure but for the normal data point. So I will choose partitions at random, until the selected data point is isolated. In this case, it took 8 tries to isolate the normal point. We need to do this for every data point and record how many tries it took to isolate a particular data point. In isolation forests, a tree is generated recursively by randomly selecting a feature and then selecting a partition point between the maximum and minimum value of that feature. Each partition corresponds to a split point in a tree, the isolation tree. The procedure terminates when all instances are isolated. The number of partitions, split lines, that were required to isolate a point correspond to the path length of that point to the root of the tree. Since anomalies are easier to isolate, they will be closer to the root of the tree. An instance is marked as an anomaly if it has a short average path length to the root across many isolation trees. Here we have a plot of the average path length for the normal and anomalous data points. On average, we can see that the anomalous data points have a smaller average path length compared to the normal data points. So we can use this information to classify points as anomalous if they have an average path length smaller than a given threshold. In reality, instead of directly using the average path length for deciding whether or not an instance is an anomaly, the authors of the original method propose an anomaly score that is between 0 and 1. The closer the anomaly score is to 1, the more likely the instance is an anomaly. When building isolation forests, we can encounter 2 different types of problems: swamping and masking. Swamping is when normal instances are too close to anomalies and thus marked as anomalies. Masking refers to the presence of too many anomalies close together. In this figure we can see the original dataset, and here we can see that it is difficult to differentiate between anomalies and normal data points because they are very close together. After performing sampling, now we can see that the anomalous data points are easier to isolate. The only two parameters of the algorithm are the number of trees and the sampling size. Isolation forests work with features, thus we need to extract features from the trajectories. The library trajectories already include some functions that we can use to extract features. For example, we can compute the mean speed, the standard deviation of the speed, the minimum speed, the maximum speed, and so on. We will do the same for the acceleration. At the end, we will end up with 8 features. And this is how the dataset looks like after the feature extraction process. Before training the models, it is a good idea to visualize the features. Here I'm using multidimensional scaling to plot the features into 2 dimensions, because if you remember, we extracted 8 features. Here we have 54 abnormal cases and around 1000 normal cases. From this plot we can see that the normal cases are clustered into this region here, and the abnormal cases are more or less clustered in this region. So by visually inspecting this figure, we can see that the abnormal cases are in the right hand side of the plot. So we should be able to separate or to differentiate them using a model. Before training the model, we need to partition the data. One of the advantages of isolation forests is that they don't need examples of the anomalous data points. Since abnormal cases are limited, they all will be used for the test set. In this case, the training set will consist of 80% of the data, and the remaining will be assigned to the test set. The Solitude library implements the isolation forest algorithm, and here I'm first importing the library and then creating a new object of type isolation forest. The first argument is the sample size. The original authors suggest to set this to 256, and I'm using 100 trees. The last argument, nproc, specifies the number of CPU cores to use for the calculation. In this case, I'm setting this to 1. Finally, I will feed the model and pass the training data, removing any IDs and labels. Now that the model is trained, we can start making predictions using the predict method. In this case, I'm going to predict anomaly scores on the training set. Remember that the anomaly scores are values from 0 to 1. The closer to 1, the more likely the point is an anomalous data point. Then I'm going to sort and display instances with the highest anomaly scores at the top. Here we can see that the highest anomaly score was 0.75, then 0.73, and so on. Based on the previous anomaly scores, we can set a threshold of, for example, 0.76. Everything that is above 76 will be considered as an anomalous data point. Then we can actually predict the anomaly scores on the test set using the predict function. By using this threshold, we will get the following results. Here we can see that the sensitivity was only 22%. This means that only 12 anomalous data points were identified as such, and we missed 54 of them. On the other hand, all the normal points were identified as such. One thing we can do to increase the performance of our model is to decrease the threshold. In this case, we can choose something like 0.6. If we do that, this time the sensitivity increased to 83%. This means that we were able to identify 45 anomaly data points out of the 54. On the other hand, the performance for the normal data points was reduced. In this case, we misclassified 14 normal data points. So far, we have chosen the thresholds manually. But one thing we can do is to try to plot a ROC curve to see how different thresholds would behave. In this case, in the x-axis we have the false positive rate, and in the y-axis we have the sensitivity. We make the plot by trying multiple thresholds. Ideally, we would like to have a sensitivity close to 1 and a false positive rate close to 0. Here we can also compute the area under the curve, which is a measure of the performance of your model. The closer to 1, the better. In this case, we got a 95 area under the curve, which is very high. So in this presentation, I show you how to perform an exploratory data analysis of fish trajectories. Then I show you how to plot trajectories with the trajectory library. Then we perform feature extraction before training our model. Then we train an isolation forest to detect anomalous data points. And finally, we evaluated the performance of the model using rock curves and area under the curve performance measures. And thank you very much for your attention.